Hi everyone, thank you all so much for coming out tonight to this panel. So when the story broke in October last year, accusing Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein of decades worth of sexual harassment and assault against women, I knew that the J School would want to hear the story from the horse's mouth. I immediately emailed the reporters at the New York Times, but was disappointed initially when they said they would only be able to get to us in January. I thought the hype would be over by then. I was wrong. Since the Times reported the allegations against Weinstein, a new era of reporting on sexual harassment has exploded. Not only has the Weinstein investigation opened a floodgate that has empowered women to say, "Me too," but it has set a new standard for stories of abuse. It's been inspiring to see the deep, judicious reporting and the sensitivity with which journalists have reported these allegations. We are in an unprecedented moment of reckoning as women declare that time is up on sexual harassment. But how should journalists shoulder this burden, and what does it mean for the news industry? We're incredibly excited to welcome one of the journalists behind this seismic shift. Megan Toohey is an investigative reporter for the New York Times, who together with her colleague Jodie Cantor unearthed the investigation against Weinstein. She's been a Pulitzer Prize finalist and won numerous other awards for her investigations. We're also thrilled to have Gabriel Sherman. Gabe is a special correspondent at Vanity Fair and a regular contributor to NBC and MSNBC. In 2014, he published the best-selling book, The Loudest Voice in the Room, How the Brilliant, Bombastic Roger Ailes Built Fox News and Divided a Country. With over 600 interviews, he exposed the culture of Fox News and how Ailes used his position of power to make unwanted sexual advances in the newsroom. We're also delighted to welcome Erin Carmone. She was named in 2011 as one of Forbes' 30 under 30 names to watch in media. She has been a national reporter at NBC News and MSNBC, reporting on gender, politics, and the law. She is a contributing writer at the Washington Post, where in November last year, she and her colleague Amy Britton broke the allegations against television journalist and talk show host Charlie Rose. Our moderator tonight, I'm sure, needs no introduction. Jill Abramson is a professor at Harvard University and a political columnist at The Guardian. She has been a trailblazer in newsrooms since her career began. At the New York Times, she served as Washington bureau chief, managing editor, and was the Times' first female executive editor. We're very grateful to them all for joining us this evening. Finally, a really quick thank you to everyone who made this event possible: the events team, the AV team, Women in Media, the Dart Centre, and everyone at SPJ, particularly our advisor, Rebecca Castillo. Thank you for joining us as we take this time to reflect and question this moment in journalism. Enjoy the show.
I've moderated more than a few panels, and some panels here at Columbia. I don't usually begin this way, but I really just want to begin by saluting the three of you, because you know, in some ways, when I look at my own career, the work that I'm proudest of is the investigative work that Jane Mayer and I did that produced our book about the Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill case, Strange Justice. I'm kind of left thinking that we were patient zero or something approaching that. But I really do have an appreciation for how difficult reporting on this subject is. It's really hard to A, ask questions about this subject, B, win the confidence of the women who were all of your sources, to get them to a place where they have confidence in you, that they can talk to you, and that you're going to be fair and accurate. and sensitive in how you deal with their cases. The fear factor, and that's kind of where I wanted to begin with each of you. The fear factor is immense for women who have worked for powerful men, even in workplaces where everybody knows, there's weird and horrible shit going on, basically. That, was true at the EEOC as Jane and I delved into Clarence Thomas's record there. But even where it's common knowledge, when a journalist calls and is asking questions about this, it creates risk, nervousness, and often a desire by the women who have been the victims to really run and hide. And so it takes, I know in all of your cases, months of work, having the door shut in your face, not once, twice, but probably multiple times. It's a very different kind of investigative reporting. So really, hats off. And I guess that's a good place to start. Is I'm sure, Megan, and I read some about the first women that you and Judy began talking to in your investigation of Harvey. But I guess how did you? What in the end do you think convinced most of the women who were in the first story to let you use their name to go on the record? What was that?
Well, it's interesting that you point out that this. I mean, you're absolutely right. I think this work this type of reporting is so grueling, and just kind of you have to force yourself every morning to get out of bed and pick up the phone and make the 100th call, knowing that you could completely have a day where you just strike out with every single phone call or every door knock you make. And you just have to be prepared to do that. And I think it's interesting that even now, 3 months after we published our first story on Weinstein, and there was this flood of coverage of sexual harassment that followed, and obviously some very important and crucial stories that came before. But this, unprecedented wave of sexual harassment journalism stories that are coming out now. At the Times, we're still doing this work. There's just numerous reporters who are still fielding phone calls and chasing tips. And even now, even as there's been this Me Too movement and a culture in which by many measures, women do feel more comfortable coming out and sharing their stories, I have colleagues, and I myself in doing reporting am still running up against people who are terrified to talk. I think that there may be an assumption that all of the difficulties have gone away, and that's not the case. I mean, I'm sitting next to colleagues who are still having those phone calls with women who have been victims in workplaces where everybody knows there's been, it's not just been rumored, it's been out in the open, the sort of predatory behavior by the boss. And women, many years later are still, even in this moment, are still terrified to come out and make accusations. And so, in the case of our first,
because they're worried about losing their jobs first and foremost, or why?
And that they're worried about. Listen, I mean, it's a big deal. Even if and even in the case of Weinstein, some of the women who ultimately went on the record are rich and famous, and you can't even imagine why. But by many measures, these should be the people who would maybe be least fearful of speaking out, who would have the money to fight back any legal action that he might take against them, who have very prominent careers and powerful voices in this culture. And even they were terrified to speak out and reluctant to go on the record. fearful that they would be the ones to suffer damage to their careers if they went forward in a story.
Gabe, what about the Fox News women who, I mean, in some ways, if Anita Hill was patient zero, I mean, that the Roger Ailes story was pre-Harvey.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, I dealt with some unique challenges in that the culture of Fox News was, in a certain way, similar to Scientology. That I don't mean that sort of flippantly. They had an internal PR department that would police anyone who spoke out against the news organization, and then they would, they had files and dossiers on, and Harvey did to some extent as well, on basically all their employees that they would leak to journalists or websites to smear them if they ever stepped out of line. So the entire culture of Fox News is one of silence, and then you layer on top of that, of course, the shame and all of the other feelings that women have about coming forward in such a public way on such a such a private matter. I think in Ailes' case, he was able to keep this secret, this serial sexual harassment secret for almost 2 decades. I think it's a testament to the culture changing. Obviously, the work Jill did, the Bill Cosby story, I think, started to open some cracks. Again, it's not a question of money or power, whether you're a millionaire actress or news personality. Speaking out about this is the most difficult choice a person could make. And so as a reporter, I think one of the things I did is I always wanted the person to feel, the subject to feel that they are, in a sense, comfortable, and I'm not, it's such a choice. I've never wanted to coerce someone into going on the record. So it was this, in certain cases, one source I worked on for years who I knew had an encounter with Ailes, and ultimately that paid off, but that was something that took a long time.
In the case of the Charlie.
Because in the Charlie Rose story, a lot of the sources were very young, like personal assistant types of his. So, I mean, there are people at the beginning of their careers. He's a very powerful figure who's in a position to help advance their careers. So I imagine, again, the fear factor was considerable.
Right.
Wow.
So for me, this was a story that was also years in the making. In 2010 was when I first started trying to report on Charlie Rose. And at the time I worked at Jezebel, and heard about it like reporters hear things, tried to follow up on it, knew of a couple of specifics and a couple of names, but people were terrified. Nobody wanted to talk about it on the record. Couldn't really independently confirm huge chunks of it. So regrettably, I put it aside. Now, I think, the Ailes reporting, Cosby, Trump, I would add, the aftermath.
I will get to that.
The aftermath of seeing Hillary Clinton's defeat, and above all, I would say 2 stories. One would be the Harvey Weinstein reporting, Your Incredible Story with Jody, the New Yorker's story by Ronan Farrow, and then at the Washington Post, which is where the Charlie Rose story ended up running, Roy Moore. So they had these women on the record who live in Alabama, who were talking about a very, very powerful man in a liberal media bastion. Those women took enormous risks, and they had gone on the record, and we were working with the same editors there. So I think all of those were factors that, when I decided to try to go back to the story, made things different. So in early November, I started reaching back out to sources to see if there was something there. And immediately people who had blown me off started calling me back. And this was incredible, I couldn't believe it. So I had been a contributing writer to the Outlook section of the Post, and I called my editor there and I said, you think you're interested in this? Maybe about 15 minutes later, I was paired with the investigative team and the investigative reporting powerhouse, Amy Britton, who's here. And
wave at us.
And, I think it's interesting that you and Jane work together, you and Jody work together. For me, I loved being part of a reporting team. We started with the sources that I had from 2010, and then in this kind of, in a way it was years in the making, but then, Amy and I went from not knowing each other to spending 17 days, breakfast, lunch, and dinner together, to expand beyond the initial reporting. Spent hours and hours and hours on the phone and meeting up with people in person and try to gain their trust in what actually was a very short period of time. I mean, again, some of them said, you know what, you've been doing this since 2010, we knew other publications were working on it, so I want to talk to you, or they said that they wanted to talk to us because we were women around their age.
That's interesting.
Because some of them, this had happened to them when they were in their 20s, now they're in their 30s.
Do you think in any cases it was out of a sense, I mean, this was sort of an appeal that Jane and I used back in the early 90s, is just, it's history. Yeah, and I was surprised, that often was a convincing reason that it, after the Hill Thomas hearings, that, it was not as big because it was pre-social media, but it was a convulsive moment. And writing in the aftermath of that did feel, that.
So I think that some of the women saw this as being part of a moment, but the thing that I think actually made the difference for them going on the record was the woman who realized that since she had worked for him, that other people had been violated. Mm-hmm. And so when we got permission to come back to some of the other women to share their stories that were at that point not on the record, but not using their names, and to read to them the accounts that were strikingly similar, and it was a really difficult and emotional experience to share these stories with them and to have them feel a sense of guilt that they hadn't spoken up sooner because
that might have stopped the cycle.
And, it's obviously not their fault, and it's understandable why people don't report this. But I think that felt like the single biggest moment, was that he might still be doing this. This woman who has a credible account of being sexually assaulted since I worked there, now I'm going to go on the record. Because if that's what it takes for this story to be believed and for something to change, that was the feeling, that was what we understood from the first woman who chose to go on the record, and it kind of rippled out from there.
I'd love the three of you to take a crack at, since the president's name has already come up, to get your sense of what role the Access Hollywood tape and then just Trump's victory in the election, rolling into the Women's March, rolling into his policies as president, had in opening the floodgates, so to speak.
Well, it's interesting. I had just joined the Times in 2016 doing investigative reporting on the presidential race and the candidates. And so I actually was one of the reporters who covered Trump's treatment of women and worked with women who came forward with allegations of sexual misconduct against him during the campaign. Right. And it was very different. It was a very different experience. The women were, certainly compared to what happened after we published our first Weinstein story, the women were, yes, the women enjoyed some very pronounced public support, but they also came under a lot of attack. Trump called all of them liars. He threatened to sue them. He called me a disgusting human being when I presented him with my findings. He, threatened to sue me in the New York Times and my reporting partner Michael Barbaro, and it was a real pressure cooker, and it was. These stories are all pressure cookers, but I think it was pretty remarkable to see that even as many women came forward with allegations, women who didn't know each other, weren't connected in any way, that there was not only these categorical that he just sort of dismissed and threatened all of them, but obviously then went on to be elected, and with a large percentage of women voting for him. And I think that really raised questions about what how the country felt about the issue of sexual misconduct and allegations of sexual misconduct. And I think in talking to some of my colleagues who have done the reporting that followed, including our colleagues Emily Steele and Mike Schmidt, who did the coverage of Bill O'Reilly, who were able to piece together a trail of settlements that he had paid to women over the years that led to him being fired by Fox. That some of the women who participated in that reporting said that they were motivated by what had happened with Trump. That there was a sense that that as women who had been victims of this type of behavior that was alleged against Trump, that didn't seem to, in his case, have much consequence, that there was a sense that they still cared about this issue and were prepared to, and it was actually a motivating factor to speak out. I think there were probably other women who felt like, took a glimpse at what happened to some of the Trump accusers and said, hell no, I'm not gonna step into that firing squad.
Gabe, with obviously Roger, you're the sexual harassment revelations about him, forced him out of his job before Trump's election, and then ironically, he, was advising Trump for a while, but you certainly have had an excellent vantage point with which to sort of observe and consider the Trump effect on these other seismic stories.
I mean, without question, I think the Trump election in the wake of the Billy Bush tape and then the dozens of women that came forward, in a certain sense it seemed to establish kind of a new precedent in which there is so much evidence on the record statements, including the now president's own voice talking about sexual assault, and yet he still won. And I think that the culture in that moment seemed to say, okay, this is not a disqualifying issue to serve in the highest office. But I think after that, and I had a sort of a unique perspective on this because I was traveling, reporting another story for Vanity Fair, a profile of Steve Bannon during the Roy Moore election, and Steve Bannon was advising the Moore campaign. Breitbart was cheerleading for the Moore campaign, and they were following the same playbook that Donald Trump did, which was double down at all costs, denounce your accusers, say it's all lies. And in that deepest red Alabama, it didn't work. And I think, again, obviously that's not a wide sample, but I think the fact that a Republican lost in Alabama by making the same case Trump did seems to show that since the election, the culture has moved slightly forward, and the way Democrats in turn have started to revisit Bill Clinton's history in the 90s, and there's been a sort of a renewed conversation around that. So I think the Trump election, certainly on both sides of the aisle has moved the conversation.
It's interesting because I actually think that one reason why the excellent reporting of the Harvey Weinstein story had such an impact that was different from the stories that came before, including Trump, is that it had very little to do with partisan politics. So yes, Harvey was a Democratic donor and he was in the Women's March and so on, but the fact that that then led for even conservative women to start sharing their stories, I think Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Roy Moore, these are people, there are people who have vested partisan interest to take one side or another when it comes to...
That was certainly true in the Al Franken case.
Right.
Yeah.
So in some ways I think that the broader issue of sexual misconduct is ill-served by, it's going to come up in partisan politics, but for the broader issue of a better understanding of our society and how victims experience things, the fact that there were recognizable people, in some ways people felt a relationship with the women who were victims, who said they were victims in the Harvey Weinstein story, I think it takes it out of this nasty, like, is it my tribe or your tribe, and it makes it into something where people did say Me Too because of that. So for Roger Ailes, they could say, oh, conservative men are disgusting, or liberal men are licentious, and so I think that's a shift that wasn't able to take place with the Trump story, even though some women did start to share in the wake of the reporting on that. I will say that...
And partly the timing, when it came out, 10 days before the election.
Yeah, I mean, people just kind of hunkered down on their sides. There wasn't even time to process everything that was happening either. I mean, to the point, to Augusta's point, that we would still be talking about this in January. We barely started. All of us are still reporting, I'm sure. I think also that for some people, Trump being elected, despite things like the Access Hollywood tape and reporting on allegations against him, was a wake-up call for some of the women who, thought that there was progress on gender, and perhaps that includes the women who voted for him, especially white women who voted for him. And I can say this isn't directly related to Trump, but this notion of the Old Boys Network, one of the women that we spoke to for the Charlie Rose story said to me, I really didn't think that I had to do anything about it because I thought he's old, he'll die. And he's not that powerful. But then they gave him the CBS Morning Show, and now he's and so I think that there was this feeling like Trump. There was commentary during the election that people like Trump and Roger Ailes, they were kind of like the death knell of the old guard. And I think the fact that Trump was elected president functioned for many people as this feeling like we're not done having this conversation, and that brought it out in a raw way that maybe people thought, I don't have to keep talking about this because it's over, these guys will die out, and it's very much not the case.
Very much not the case.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth noting that my colleague Emily Steele, who did some of the who did the O'Reilly coverage, also recently had an investigation of Vice, in which it was made clear that this wasn't just one of Harvey Weinstein's defenses was that he was just sort of a dinosaur who was behind on the changes in what was acceptable in culture,
so-called new
right?
media,
But I think that Vice piece showed that this was not generational, and that what we've learned over the past several months is that this is an issue that that's on the left. There are perpetrators on the left and on the right, and young and old, and it cannot be dismissed.
Well, Megan, that's a perfect bridge to, I wanted to ask everybody about Aziz's story, and inevitably some kind of backlash was going to develop, I thought, and you see, I think, the beginnings of it with, there's been, I think, an interesting and healthy dialogue about, that particular story, the original story, interesting appraisal of it in Jezebel, I think, yesterday, but, even, in France, you have Catherine Deneuve kind of caught in being seen as, she's being pigeonholed as someone who's saying, it's gone too far, and she's now come back and said, no, I was like an original feminist and disclosed I had an abortion way back, in the 60s or 70s. So there is kind of a tension of, is there now too much of an off with their heads psychology setting in, or reaction setting in? Is there a backlash?
I feel like I could take that as an alumna of the feminist internet, since I worked at Jezebel a few years ago, many years ago, I guess now. So, with regards to the Aziz Ansari story, I think one of the things that has been wonderful.
Do we need to say what that is
Does
for
anybody not know
people,
what that is?
or
Yeah, I feel like
no?
this is
You're
not
cool.
Okay. You can tell us more about it. There's been so much good reporting in journalism on this subject, and that was not an example of it. And I think that that's really regrettable. Because, I just know that going through the process of the Washington Post of getting a story like this to print is a really rigorous one that involved lots of hard questions, and it included, by the way, people who defended Charlie, and the number of people who told us it wasn't a hostile environment, and multiple interviews with tough questions and people making allegations, and parsing every single word and trying to think about what is relevant to put in the piece, even though there was much more than what we put in there. So I think it did a disservice to the conversation that what ran was sloppy and confusing and didn't really give him adequate time to respond. And I think also that there is a...
It wasn't really a reported piece, though. It was sort of the original Grace piece.
It was an as told to.
A personal...
Yeah, it was a personal essay.
Right.
So to me, I think that there's a category error here, because all of the stories that we've been talking about are about women going to work, right? They're labor stories.
And this was in
And this
the
is a
dating
story
round.
about negotiating consent and sexuality on a date. The women that we wrote about were not on dates for Charlie Rose. They were trying to interview for jobs. They were working for him. And so I think that we have, it's true that in the conversation about sexual harassment, we have to negotiate ideas of sexuality in our society. But I think to lump in this story, I think is a mistake, because it elides the fact that sexual harassment is a labor issue. It's a workplace issue.
And it's about power, not sex.
Yeah, and there are power dynamics in that story, but I think whatever your take is on that story, it needs to be seen as a broader conversation about sexuality and not about work.
Yeah, I think that story was not, that you're absolutely right. I mean, that story does not fall in the category of like rigorous investigative pieces that have been done.
In fairness, it didn't pretend.
It didn't pretend to be, but it didn't pretend to be, right? And I think that it's just important to note that, at the New York Times and at other publications that have done the rigorous investigative reporting, that even as this story has become more competitive, and we were working on a Charlie Rose story, as you guys, and you beat us on it, but it wasn't a scenario. But I think that people don't necessarily appreciate that even in this moment when newsrooms are getting a flood of tips and allegations basically dropped on your doorstep, which, having been somebody who was doing this reporting in 2010, and for Jody and I, when we were starting the Harvey Weinstein reporting, it wasn't a matter of like tips, dropping on our doorstep. It was like the biggest uphill climb you could possibly imagine. I think that that people need to know that we just keep hoping that the public is aware that we haven't lowered our standards in any way, even if it means getting beat. That you're still making sure that you're trying to get as many women on the record as possible. That you're looking for corroboration, whether there are records, emails, if allegations were ever put in writing, if they were ever discussed, if there were other people who were made aware of them.
Contemporaneous.
Yeah, exactly. Or maybe that's not the case, but you told your mom or your sister at the time, okay, well, we want to talk to your mom and we want to talk to your sister before we publish your account, and we're absolutely going to give the accused every opportunity to defend himself in the pages of the paper. And so, what's happening with Aziz Ansari, I think, is evidence that, and people wanting to talk about. I think what's happened in recent months is that you've moved that we're now not just looking at this sort of contained and rigorous investigative reporting. We're looking at an entire sort of society that is now asking larger questions that go beyond sexual harassment and what happens in the workplace, and into some of the broader questions about the dynamics, the power dynamics in sexual relationships, in dating, and how to tackle them. And I think that the Aziz case illustrates a hunger for additional reporting on some of these larger questions and subject matters that aren't necessarily well suited for the investigative unit at the New York Times, but are well suited for. I think it's gonna be really interesting to see how this type of reporting plays out. But I don't think you push aside the desire to have those conversations.
And there are not really, and please push back if you disagree, the dividing line between the workplace and kind of personal life is sometimes fuzzy, and at least in the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings back in 1991, one of the reasons that Joe Biden, the chairman of the committee, was so hopelessly outmaneuvered by the Republicans is before the hearings ever began, he made this deal with the Republicans that he would not venture into what he called Clarence Thomas's private life, which meant there would be no questions about whether he was a pornography addict, which was directly relevant to Anita Hill's testimony about how he harassed her in the workplace by describing porn movies. So
Yeah, I
these
just don't
things
think
aren't
that there's
as
the fuzziness of the Ansari story.
no, right. I mean,
You're
that
right,
was
there is
clearly
that
about
I guess I just feel like there's really incredible feminist criticism and thoughtful essays about that exact subject. And I just wouldn't, I'm sure a lot of you guys are already reading it. I mean, Rebecca Traister wrote an incredible piece in New York Magazine 2 years ago about, it was actually about campus sexual assault, but it was thinking about this notion of just because something may seem consensual on paper might involve coercive power dynamics. So it's not that I don't think that that conversation should happen or that it shouldn't happen outside of the realm of investigative reporting. I just feel like we have to be really thoughtful and careful about it.
Yeah,
you know, whether it's in the realm of investigative reporting or an essay, and I guess I just felt like that wasn't, and it
should be rigorous.
because there's always going to be a
one.
backlash. I mean, all of us also. I mean, Jill, you are, I think, the only person who I'm aware of who has gone on the record as an executive saying that you were aware of sexual harassment and you wished you had done something differently. It's impossible to get anybody to concede that they might have made a mistake in the past on the record. I mean, I've hardly read it, and you guys did that great piece on the reckoning, but even so, this is so rare for people to say, you know, I was complicit and I wish I had done something differently. And so I just think this is going to be upsetting because all of us are involved in it in some way or another. Even those of us who have been victims have been tangled up in it in a personal and a difficult way. And that is always going to engender people kind of defending their boundaries. That's what people are going to feel personally attacked by these conversations because they're deeply intimate. And people who have said everything is okay for so many years are going to feel upset that someone is suggesting that maybe they shouldn't have put up with it. And so backlash is inevitable. But for me, I think the subject is so important that I want to see that conversation, as
No
difficult
matter
as it is, happen with great care and thoughtfulness.
That I think we agree on both rigorous journalism and that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is always, you know, as we have these conversations at the New York Times, I mean, I think that the answer for journalists is to continue reporting, right? So this investigative journalism this rigorous investigative journalism has unleashed these sort of larger questions about sex and power and the dynamics, and I think these are now questions that are swirling around the public and in a way that goes beyond maybe people who followed certain sort of feminist essays, you know, back in the day. And so I think that the question for journalists is to say, okay, well, listen, there's a lot of debate about this Aziz Ansari situation. Well, what do you do about it as a news organization? We'll figure out how to cover it.
Right.
I mean, cover the debate that's taking place in the country and in right now about what does constitute sexual coercion, what is sexual assault. Are there different definitions if you're looking at sort of the criminal statute versus the way sexual assault is defined on college campuses? And I think it's just I think it's oftentimes the answer to complicated and messy things that are popping up is to continue reporting on them.
I think just in regards to the Aziz Ansari story, I think I come at this whole subject from a entirely different place because my entree into writing about Roger Ailes' sexual harassment was the fact that I covered Fox News for years. It was an institutional story that I followed the story where it took me, and that's kind of where it ended up. And what I find most valuable to focus on in terms of this type of reporting is, again, the institutional part of the story, the way, the levers of
I wanted, in terms of institutional response, I'm not sure this applies as much to Charlie Rose, but come at me if it's relevant. But certainly with both Harvey and Roger, they had, and one of my favorite stories in your Harvey oeuvre at this point is the piece about David Boies and the attack machine that Harvey had built up to discredit and destroy any woman or anyone who would come forward with information about his sexual assault of women. And Gabe, you spoke at the beginning of the panel about how Fox had this elaborate oppo structure for journalists, but Roger, just on the issue of harassment, also was in case, and did that make you fearful at any point in your reporting before the stories were published that they're going to turn this machine on me?
Well, yes,
did
and
they?
Well, yes and no. I went through it with my book, and there was elements of sexual harassment covered in my book, although not at the scale that was later revealed after Gretchen Carlson filed her lawsuit. So Roger Ailes, commissioned a 400-page dossier about my personal life. He had PIs follow me and my wife around. He used Breitbart to, smear me as a George Soros-backed attack dog. I think that was one quote. At one point, we got a death threat at home, and we did call the NYPD just to put that on the record. So yeah, that's a form of intimidation and coercion. I think that people like Ailes and Weinstein use to try to silence reporters who are digging in areas they don't like. But to me, it just was affirmation that I was onto a good story. And then sort of the more Roger pushed back, the harder I would dig, because anyone who's that fearful of exposure clearly is hiding something. And as a reporter who likes to dig, you want to find that thing. But just one last point on the institutional part. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Fox story that I found was the ways in which Ailes used the tools, all the corporate tools at his disposal to create a system that allowed him to sexually harass women. Using the legal department at Fox News to push through settlements that had very coercive non-disclosure agreements, using the PR department to smear people who might speak up. That to me is, the real, kind of heart of the story, the way public companies and, widely respected companies like the Weinstein companies were used to abuse women. And that, there is a lot of, history in America of stories of corporate abuse, but I really do think we're living through the era where we realize that we've had sexual harassment on an industrial scale. And the entire sort of corporate system was set up to silence women. I think finally we're getting to a place now where companies, and I think Microsoft, I could be wrong, but has now done away with non-disclosures when it comes to sexual harassment.
That was a huge factor in the Vice story, where these NDAs and alternative workplace agreements that new employees had to sign that were coded, like you may see some upsetting, very graphic, sexual.
You sign your rights away the moment you walk in the door.
And then that is the sort of the second and third and fourth level of reporting when you're covering these stories. It's one thing to nail down the allegations of sort of predatory behavior or violations by a particular individual and to shine light on that individual's actions. But it's really important as journalists to then ask yourself, who else was aware of their behavior? Who was made aware of it and what did they do to respond? And in terms of institutions and individuals, and in the case of Weinstein, there was kind of endless additional reporting to do on that front because he had so many powerful relationships and had been able to pull in so many different institutions and individuals into sort of, whether knowingly or unknowingly, into enabling his predatory behavior over the years.
Can you talk at all about, before the story was published, like David Boyce's dealings with the Times or his PR people, like how did they try to prevent publication, essentially?
Yes. They did. yeah, he had a variety of, I mean, he kind of had an army of PR folks and attorneys who were working with him to halt or alter the story to the best of their abilities, and that included Charles Harder, who was
used as well.
yeah,
Right.
and who I think may have just stepped in
For Trump.
for Trump. He worked with Melania on a successful lawsuit that she brought. But yeah, just to refresh your memories, Charles Harder was an attorney who helped Hulk Hogan sue Gawker out of existence, and so he was sending threatening letters. And after our story, I mean, even after our story ran, Trump was on the one hand, Weinstein was on the one hand issuing a statement in which he was claiming that he was, kind of regretted past behavior and was going to take a leave of absence. Yeah, right, exactly. And was going to, Lisa Bloom was helping him learn new ways, and he was going to take a break and go off and fix himself. On the other hand, part of this army that he'd assembled was actively threatening to sue the New York Times. And so
I might add, not for the first time.
Yeah, right.
I had many experiences as managing editor and maybe one or two as executive editor of
right.
party threatening to sue.
Yeah, well, there was a reason that there had been so many it's pretty widely known that there had been so many publications that had tried and failed to do this story.
Wasn't just about
just in general, right? Exactly. Yeah. No, I know. Yeah.
Stories that said, Miramax and then the Weinstein Company were having trouble, but he was. Yeah.
And he succeeded in a lot of cases, and it was something that we ran up against in trying to do this reporting and get sources to talk to us, was this sense that it was inevitable that Weinstein was ultimately going to come into the New York Times and intimidate us out of publishing the story, even if we were able to get it. And so I spent a lot of time, Dave McCraw, the attorney for the Times, is I've spent a lot of time.
A hero of journalism.
Yeah, exactly. Both dealing with, I got to know him when doing Trump coverage, and including working with women who came forward with allegations against him, and also with Weinstein. And he's, there's no doubt that when it comes to doing these type of stories, you're not just having conversations with your editors, you're having conversations with the company attorney on how to proceed.
Charlie seemed to go quickly, but was there intense?
Charlie did not have Mossad agents come after me. Although being Israeli, I was kind of like, come on. Kind of want to know what people could find on you. No, I think something Megan said, I think really struck with me about this notion of who knew and who told whom at what point. And it strikes me, as our reporting continues, that these stories are far more challenging than establishing that somebody had a pattern, that there are multiple people who described remarkably similar harassment allegations. And I know put you on the spot before, Jill, but I think there haven't been that many stories about who knew what. And I think it's interesting, just broadly speaking, that in many cases, and I'm thinking about NBC where I had no knowledge of this, but I used to work there, that we've now reached a point where organizations are firing people, and that potentially stymies reporting. I mean, not because dogged reporters are stopping, right? But Franken, Matt Lauer, these guys, some of them, they went really quickly. And
some of the men who have been fired are very aggressively saying, there wasn't a fair process. Some of them weren't. They're innocent.
Yes, but what I'm trying to say more is that the companies are trying to say, we fired him and it's over.
Nothing to see.
Right.
We have no.
Yeah.
Right. They're doing so I'm not speaking specifically that I have knowledge or anything in NBC, because I do not. But it just strikes me like I thought, I'm glad that they didn't fire Charlie the moment we asked them for comment, because I would like the reporting to see the light of day, just selfishly. I'm aware of in multiple of these stories that people no longer want to talk about it because the person has been fired. And I think to some extent, you know, I think it seems like Roger Ailes and Harvey Weinstein, the scale with which the institutional mechanisms, you know, colluded in this
Was
is
immense.
impressive, it's
Immense.
terrifying. But most people who engage in sexual harassment, it's far more banal. And the institutional mechanisms that protect them are not necessarily hiring ex-spies or, and they're much more kind of the way that the workplace works. And
I would say that's true, but not in the political arena. When it's a politician accused, this, you know, the stakes are high, and there is always a partisan protection racket.
Absolutely. I guess all I'm saying is, even without somebody who behaves like an ogre to cover up their harassment, there are wheels turning to keep them protected until, you know, we're seeing so many people get fired. And I think it's just a harder story to do, to find out who knew what when. And that's just been my observation, that there are a lot of places that I'd like to read stories about, and there are things that you just hear back channel about there being more accusers, but they don't want to talk because, you know, this person resigned or this person quit.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, our first Weinstein story was, I think, like 3,000 words, and we obviously did many Weinstein stories, culminating in. We'll continue to report on it. I mean, it'll be interesting to see if he actually ends up getting arrested and convicted of any crimes.
Yeah, where is he?
He's in a rehab place in Arizona, so still there, and it's going to be interesting to see if he's charged. There's now 3 jurisdictions investigating him: New York, LA, and London. So we're going to be following what happens with that and with his company. But you know, we did a story like on his complicity machine, really going at
that
like
was the boy's story,
and that was
about.
I think like a 7,000 word
That
story.
was fantastic.
And so I think it was, you know, it was interesting. Even after Harvey got fired, like we just didn't take a breath. I mean, we said, listen, it's just as important, if not more important, to understand how he got away with this and who was involved and who glimpsed this activity. And that was reporting that took us. We looked at basically his relationships. Well, we looked at the talent agencies, you know, CAA being one of the top talent agencies that continued to send women into hotel rooms to meet with Weinstein, even after women reported back to at least 8 agents that they had disturbing encounters with him. We looked at his relationship with the media, the ways in which he was able to manipulate news organizations and journalists into either not covering him, or in the case of AMI, which owns the National Enquirer, actually digging up dirt on his accusers for him. We looked at the lawyers. You know, we looked at the lawyers like David Boies, who swooped in, lawyers who, on the one hand, were representing, you know, helped Harvey cover up basically strike settlements with accusers who stepped forward over the years, but also were supposedly working for the companies themselves. So by a certain perspective, helping to cover up one of their biggest liability.
Mm-hmm.
We looked at, so there was just, I mean, this is all to say that when you're doing this reporting, I think it can be tantalizing and almost easy to stop once you've exposed the individual, but to keep going and figure out what were the systems in place. And listen, like, you know, not everybody who engages in sexual harassment or misconduct is a Harvey Weinstein or a Charlie Rose or a Roger Ailes, who's, you know, has that much power and prestige and money behind them. But I do think that even in these cases, you're able to see systemic failures that ripple out through all different industries and all different workplaces. Problems with HR. There were women who stepped forward to complain to HR.
Can I have a footnote here? The HR person at Vice, until she was fired, was a woman named Nancy Ashbrook, whose previous job was as the HR person at the Weinstein.
Yeah, that was a moment of where we were talking to Emily Steele, who was reporting on Vice while we were reporting on Harvey Weinstein, and we're like, has Nancy Ashbrook come up? It was interesting there were interesting figures that popped up, both not, you know, I think that there's an assumption that all of the bad guys in these stories are men, and we didn't actually end up doing a lot of substantial reporting on Nancy Ashbrook, so I can't speak to her, but there were, Lisa Bloom was an interesting figure who popped up in the course of our reporting. She is Gloria Allred's daughter and has, like Gloria Allred, made a career out of framing herself as a feminist who represents victims of powerful men. And she had, when you ask what was it like dealing with Weinstein as we were reporting this story and who were we dealing with aside from, say, a David Boies, well, Lisa Bloom was by Harvey Weinstein's side on this issue, trying to stop the story, and I believe had worked with, I can't remember who else it was that she had worked with, but it was an interesting and sort of unexpected character to be dealing with, who on the one hand sort of claimed to have these major feminist credentials, and on the other hand was seemingly working to help Harvey cover up his misconduct. And once again, that was a relationship that was struck after she had done a business deal with Harvey.
Right.
In the Ailes case, the complicity machine may also be venture into the realm of criminal activity. After my reporting in the fall of 2016, the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York opened an investigation into whether people at Fox News misused corporate resources as a publicly traded company and not reporting that to shareholders as materially relevant to investors. So that, again, that's another example in which, it's not just the predator like Roger Ailes or Harvey Weinstein, people who have, transgressed. It's this, the lawyers, the accountants, the CFO, all of the other corporate officers who exist to sort of prop up the predator at the top, and either look the other way or knowingly sign these settlements that they know to cover up terrible behavior.
Mm-hmm. We're going to have time for questions, and there are 2 microphones there and there, so just line up if you want to ask questions. I hope you do. I just quickly, where's it going? Is it going to, is the story going to continue new revelations at kind of the boiling point that we've been at, or is it?
I just know from conversations, and I'm curious what you guys think, with my reporter friends, it seems like every day you wake up, it's like, who's next, right? There was this moment where Louis C.K., it just was this drumbeat of allegations and people losing jobs and being fired and being canceled off TV shows. So I think, there are, and I think the Times has done great work on this. This is not a high-class problem. I think in industries like food service, it's like food service, factory floors, there are
hotel workers,
whole corners of American life where this light needs to be shown.
Yeah, I think that's sort of what I was trying to get at in terms of, I think it's very significant that the people who were shaping our cultural narratives in our media, in many cases, there are credible allegations of harassment against them. I think it's significant on its own because these are the people who shape our narratives and have so much power and millions of dollars at their disposal. But like I said, the daily reality of sexual misconduct is far more banal and involves people who have power over other people's lives, but maybe not power over the national conversation. So I know that this is a subject that I've been committed to for my entire career, gender equality and all the ways that it plays out in our daily lives, or inequality, and our reporting continues to.
And you're working on a book with Jody, right?
Yes. So Jody, my reporting partner Jody, and I are going to be writing a book about our the experience reporting the Weinstein case, and then other aspects of what's played out. And meantime, at the New York Times, you're absolutely right. I think that we recognized the New York Times had decided actually early on in the year, back to the coverage that we had done on Bill O'Reilly, that we were going to do sexual harassment coverage this year, even before the Me Too movement, and that we were going to go out, and so early in the year had decided to look at, and our colleagues also did a pretty did a very impressive story looking at talking about how this goes beyond just some of the elite industries and into. Two of our colleagues went into the world of a Ford plant in Chicago where there had been, repeated harassment, even after the EEOC had come in to police the place. And so I think that, moving forward, what I can say is that the New York Times has, is continuing to report on various aspects of this, not just various investigative pieces on certain workplaces or individuals, but also what's happening with this Me Too movement and how it's playing out, the ripple effects and these larger questions that have emerged. I think that, as I said, I think that this is a moment in which sexual harassment and sexual conduct and power dynamics, require a variety of types of reporting.
Thank you so much for coming out today. I really appreciate it. I actually have a question about many of us who are women maybe have experience with harassment, describing, or even assault, and our role as reporters. When we talk about objectivity and when we talk about our need to remove ourselves from the situations in which we may find ourselves emotionally involved, what do you recommend?
I mean, I've been a newspaper reporter for many years, and in the conversations that I've had with editors over the years, and I don't know what your line is on this, Jill, but I think that it's foolish to think that as reporters we don't come to the job with certain biases, and I think it's biases that can shape the sort of the various areas of interest you have when it comes to what you're naturally pulled towards when it comes to reporting, what you're motivated to dig into and try to uncover truths in. But I think it's foolish. Anybody who says you should try to limit that you should try to pretend you don't have any biases, I think is just not being realistic. But I think it's always a matter of making sure that you recognize them and try to ensure that they're not playing out in the fairness and accuracy that's required of the reporting that we do. And so I think that they're important to acknowledge going into it and not pretend they don't exist, but to really make sure that they're not detracting from the fairness and accuracy of your reporting.
And I just add, a really important thing is to go in with a determination to listen and a willingness to be surprised, not to reach a judgment before you finish your reporting.
Yeah, that's absolutely.
It sounds like you were also asking about people who are survivors feeling emotionally connected to the story or triggered by it. Is that part of your question?
In a way, but also, some people may say you cannot write a story about sexual assault if you have experienced it. I thought it was interesting that. So I mean, that's a debate.
Yeah, I mean, I've never heard anybody say that, but I think that would disqualify a lot of people, just given how endemic of a phenomenon it is. So I think, again, to me, I wouldn't say that I wasn't emotionally affected talking to these women for hours, spending hours on the phone with them late at night and being with them, and you are still a human being talking to people. Of course, what you then publish has to go through the utmost, rigorous standards, and you have to answer for it with many people who were not in that room. But I've always thought, that the idea is integrity and transparency about where you're coming from. I mean, even the story that we published in the Washington Post included the fact that I had started working on it in 2010. Everything, and we included things in our story that potentially made the women making the allegations potentially undermine their stories, right? For example, one of them sent emails after the fact to Charlie saying that she had a great time at Belcourt, even though she was telling us she didn't have a great time. And so I think even including everything in the piece that you think might show that you've really thought through this, that even though you think these stories are credible enough to put in the newspaper, and you've made a human connection with them. I mean, you're not a robot. You're not a reporting robot. For me, I had nightmares while I was working on this story. It is an emotionally affecting subject. It's not like reporting on the SEC. Maybe for some people, reporting on the SEC is like that, but not me.
Yeah, and I would actually take issue. I mean, I'd like to sort of amend what I said just a little bit, which is I think there's no doubt that your personal experience is going to affect what type of subject matters interest you. But I think that a bias I think would be if that personal experience somehow got in the way of of your judgment or prevented you from basically not sticking to the truth. And I think that, but to say that your personal experiences don't play a role in what motivates you to get up in the morning and do this work, I think would be naive.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I think my question is, as journalists working on these stories, you guys need victims to go on the record. But as we've seen in some situations, like when a boy or accuser, her house burned down, and an arson case, I mean, there are real risks to coming forward with these stories. And on the other hand, I think Erin mentioned kind of the idea that sometimes people came forward because they felt they had a responsibility. And I think in the aftermath of the Me Too movement, there was a real debate: do women owe us these stories? If someone's not ready, how do we pin that to say, oh, but you should come forward and say something because it can have a real change. So as reporters, how do you kind of negotiate needing someone to go on the record and say these things because it is an important story, and also, negotiating just that these are really, really tough things that could have negative impacts on people's lives?
You want me to take a cut at that? Because those issues are familiar to me in all kinds of stories in other realms. And when the reporter is witting of risk, of personal risk, especially to a source who is not a celebrity or a politician, but is kind of an average person who may not be completely witting of the consequences of being in the middle of a story or having their name and personal story in the New York Times or the Washington Post or Vanity Fair. I mean, something that I always do, even sometimes at the risk of losing someone going on the record, is at least make them witting that their life could change in a not altogether wonderful way by being in the middle of, especially this story right now gets so much attention, every new one, that I have always felt a duty to do that, even though it isn't a journalistic rule, number one. And
I mean, I think what sucks about it is that, if you're talking to somebody who has a credible story of being a victim, they didn't ask to be in the news, they're not a public official you're holding accountable, they haven't chosen a public life, and they have a right to, their own experiences. And for you as a journalist, you want to be persistent, but you don't want to push them.
You don't want to be
because there's somebody who is telling you a story about being pushed against, past their boundaries. You don't want to be that person who's like, I mean, it's creepy because the process of reporting sometimes sounds like you're sexually harassing this person, like you're texting them again, you're emailing them again, you're like,
well, that veers into, like, in the coverage of rapes, the whole re-traumatizing.
Yeah, you have to be really, I mean, I think that there were a couple of factors with the women in the Charlie story, and some of which we learned from the reporters in the Roy Moore story, in particular, how they did things. Part of it was also, being professional, but also giving them a sense of control over the way, like, that we could talk for a long time off the record, and then we could figure out what they were comfortable with going on the record with. That they wouldn't necessarily be the only ones. So in some of these stories, people jump, one person might be the person to jump first, but there might be a hold hands and jump together, and you have to be really careful with it, right? Because you don't want to interfere with the course of the story, but a big factor is what I mentioned before, which was even just getting permission from them when their stories were off the record to say, is it okay with you if I share the story with this person under these particular circumstances, and once they got a sense that they wouldn't be the only ones on a limb, and we have a woman who we identify in our story who said that what happened to her she didn't think was so bad, but she chose to go on the record because she said if there are more names in the story, it would be easier for the other women who have more, what she called more serious stories. And so I think she kind of took one for the team. And everyone has a good reason for not going on the record. I mean, one of the women in our story was pregnant and her husband didn't want her to. One of them was between jobs. One of them had a husband who had been arrested for abusing her.
Oh, come on, in the world of trolling, like,
Yeah.
in some ways I think, who in their right mind?
Yeah,
would-
it's a big sacrifice of your privacy. And so, again, yes, you're right. At no point are you like trying to trick them into going on the record. You have to say, this could be really difficult. This could suck. It would be really important to my story, but that's my problem, not your problem.
Thank you. Hi. Thank you all for being here and also for the work that you've done. You sort of answered this a little bit, Megan, but what is next for you guys? Do you intend to stay on this beat for a while, or are there other arenas that you would like to investigate?
Okay, but I don't know if you've answered that question.
So I've been covering national politics and Trump world loosely defined for Vanity Fair. To the degree, I think Stormy Daniels is in the news today. So I think sexual harassment and Donald Trump will be an ongoing storyline. But in terms of this, sexual harassment as a beat, that's not my beat. I cover power and influence, politics, and media. So, to the degree that that is present in that world is something I'll definitely cover.
Before I put it on hold to work on the Charlie Rose story, I was beginning work on a book about men and can they change. Men as partners in gender equality and the sort of realizing that our conversations about the workplace, the family, and violence prevention all hinge on whether men will change in a systemic way, not can you find a good man who will change, but and so I'm going to return to reporting on that. But of course, this fundamental question: what happens to these guys after they get fired? What about the ones who maybe didn't commit crimes, but are potentially seeing the world differently? I think that I'm really interested in how do we, as a society, deal with all this new information that we have, and maybe prevent it from happening again. I don't know. How do we do that? Those are some of the questions that I want to report out.
You want to say anything more about your staying on the story and doing a book?
Right. Yeah. I mean. Right. Yeah. I'm not trying to figure out how it will all play out, but that's the plan.
I feel a desire to disclose that I am right now working on a whole new story about Clarence Thomas.
Cannot wait to read it.
Yeah. Some of the women that I'm calling are 70 years old and retired, and their voices still quake with fear, even after all of these other stories. And I'm not surprised at that.
Can you tell us anything
No.
about?
Well, we know he's still got a job, is what I hear. So I can understand why they're intimidated.
The three of you have all mentioned personal effects. The investigative reporting is grueling. There's effects on your personal safety and your emotional health. And I would really like to hear how the three of you manage those aspects. I mean, you've really been very public about talking about how when you receive death threats, sometimes you had to leave your home temporarily, or Aaron, you talked about nightmares. And I think for students who are encouraged to pursue investigative projects, there hasn't been a lot of advice about managing your time. Like in the rush to get to beat the competition, you end up working very long hours, and you sacrifice a lot emotionally, psychologically, and in some cases safety-wise. I'd really like to hear how the three of you deal with this on an ongoing basis as we continue to do these stories that a lot of people are interested in, and then a lot of people are interested in stopping you from continuing to publish?
Well, I think that when you get to, I think it's always a really wonderful moment if and when you get to a point in your journalism career where you're not just doing what the editors assign you. You've got some choice in what you pursue. And especially with investigative journalism, I mean, you really have to care about the subject matter in order to get up and do the grueling work day in and day out, even when it involves everything that you just described. And so I'd start by saying that pick your subject matters carefully. Make sure that it's something that you're willing to sacrifice for. Find those issues that really are going to be worth, basically hits to your physical well-being and your, I did this reporting. I started the Harvey Weinstein story my first day back from a maternity leave, so I had a 4-month-old baby at home, and I had to just sort of say, I'm going to put my family second while I do this work. But I was, I had a lot of motivation. I mean, with a baby daughter, I thought, okay, well, it's worth to make this personal sacrifice, because I think that this work has the power to make the world a safer place for her. So I would just say, if and when you can, to make sure that you pick things that you really care deeply about.
Can I dive in with something? I think it's a really interesting and important question. I think that in this hyperspeed news cycle that we all operate in now, that helping investigative reporters fortify themselves to deal with just the kinds of issues you raise is the job of a good editor who's working hand in glove, hopefully, with the reporters who are on the front lines on these stories. That is what editors are for, is to work through investigative reporting, no matter what subject. If you're working for weeks on it's a manic depressive work cycle, and you sometimes need help getting through the ups and downs of that, and that's what a good editor is for, is to be smart and perceptive and empathetic about all of that.
Yeah, I was actually going to say that I think the fact that a lot of these stories are a team effort, even the names that you don't see, having worked in a lot of different media, it felt like a luxury. I mean, 17 days is, I know Amy has said it's the shortest investigation that she's ever worked on, but I worked at a place where I had to file 3 or 4 times a day. And so I've had both of those experiences in different kinds of paces throughout my career. So even having the time to sit down and talk, now we're working on an investigative piece, so we have more time, we can sit down and reflect. To me, it really, and I'm so curious about, you and Jody working together and you and Jane working together, because for me and Amy, to be able to, some of these interviews we conducted together, some of them we conducted separately, and I co-wrote a book. And so I actually think that too is a great dynamic for this, to be able to kind of debrief, even just to process it, because, your partner or your best friend, you may not be able to tell them everything, and even if you are, it may be so incremental that they don't even understand why it's important. And so to be able to debrief with that person, and then for the first Charlie piece, we had the great privilege of having amazing involved editors who did check in with us, and checked in with us also about our emotional health. And it was interesting because Amy and I are both women in our early 30s, and these were, like classic newspaper, like older investigative guys, and they approached the subject with so much professionalism and so much sensitivity. It was a wonderful editing experience, frankly, unlike any I've had before. And to recognize, I think that there's a kind of old school tradition, which is that like nothing gets to me. I just do my job. I'm just kind of like a tough person. And I think we've started to have a little bit more of an evolved understanding of the fact that we're all professionals and we chose this life and we were interested in doing difficult stories, but at the same time we're human beings and we maybe need time to just talk it through with an editor. and to say, you know, this is hard today, or I don't know what I'm doing here. And that's even beyond the question of emotional trauma or physical safety, right? It might just be like, what the fuck is the story right now? I don't know what I'm doing. But to be able to be honest that you don't always have it figured out, I think is the through line.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think in my case, it's important to recognize the strain and pressure you may be under, and I think I was in denial for a long time about what being under the onslaught of Roger Ailes, Fox News, the whole right-wing media machine. And I remember the day after Roger Ailes was fired, I was flying home, as it happened, from the Republican convention in Cleveland, where Trump accepted the nomination. It was just this surreal moment of Trump was being nominated, Roger Ailes had just been fired, all of these women at Fox News were coming forward to share their accounts, their harrowing experiences, and I remember falling into the airplane seat to fly home, and just like tears just started streaming down my face, and I'm not really that normally outwardly an emotional person. It was just like this groundswell of things that I had been, in all of their stories that I had been sort of internalizing came to the surface. So that, but I don't think that's super healthy. I think if you're going to do this work, you need to, I think you need to sort of recognize that it's really traumatic, and it's okay if you don't need to be a robot. You can really take the time to say this is hard work, and it's meaningful work.
I have to apologize to the last question askers because we are out. What?
We can do them if they're quick.
Quick. Yes or no answer.
A lot of those committing sexual assault aren't in power positions. Think Wall Street. Have you thought about those dynamics as well?
Short answer, yes, of course. I mean, Wall Street is fertile ground, I would have to imagine, for any of these sort of industries where there's men in positions of power.
Along those lines, how do you think reporting needs to reflect that people in industries outside of media and entertainment don't have the same kind of face recognition and don't suffer the same consequences for being named? So someone in Wall Street maybe doesn't suffer the same way for having a story published about them.
Well, it's funny how we've just construed Wall Street as the powerless order. That's how they think of themselves. I do think as we got a lot of tips in our inbox, that I can only imagine what your inboxes look like. There's this terrible thing. We had already knew what we were working on, so it wasn't like we were like shopping around the story. But you're kind of looking at this tip, and there's a risk of saying like, oh, like, what was this person famous enough? I mean, like, were you lucky to be harassed by somebody who's famous? Like the flippant, not what I actually feel, but the kind of you're thinking in this media landscape where so many recognizable people are getting harassed, and that's why I think it's so important that we start to see reporting that is about industries. There's a great Portland story, and there have been stories about women in detention, immigration detention. There's been hotel workers organizing. I think the Time's Up initiative is trying really hard to not only be about entertainment. So again, this is to expand the point that I was making before about partisan politics. This is not just about famous and powerful people, right? It's about, we need to take it out of the realm of just like, is media or is entertainment particularly ripe for abuse? Sure, any place where people have disproportionate power is a place ripe for abuse, but the supervisor on a shift of minimum wage workers who are barely making ends meet has their own set of power too. So I think that there is great reporting happening, and I just hope that everybody reads those stories with the same kind of breathless enthusiasm, because there was reporting on sexual harassment before too, and I will say that having access to traffic numbers at various places where I've worked, it can be really difficult to command people's attention. And so I think you try to do it with the best story that you can report out and with the greatest storytelling that you can. And you hope that maybe now, if you go back to those stories, more people will pay attention because they'll connect the dots.
Thank you, Maria.